The Modi government yesterday scrapped the retrospective tax. Now remember, this is something that was brought in 2012 by then Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee. A move that was seen as largely being regressive. It has been criticized over the years and has been something that perhaps has put India off the map for many foreign investors. So in this episode of Government Matters with Ramya Nair, what we're going to try and look at is what impact the scrapping of this tax will have, whether it will make India a more attractive destination for foreign investors, whether it will revive the trust in India as far as these investors are concerned. Do start sending in your questions. So Ramya, I think just a little bit for lay people like me, if you can just go back, tell us what the tax did and why it was so controversial.
Right. So the origin of it is a case that the Income Tax Department had filed against Vodafone, basically regarding Vodafone's acquisition of another company, which is Hutchison SR, and the resulting capital gains that arose from such a transaction. The Income Tax Department's contention was that $11 billion transaction was taxable in India, whereas because it was a transaction which was not taxed anywhere, whereas the company stand was that this transaction is not taxable in India because it was an overseas transfer of shares. But the tax department pointed out that the underlying assets of that company are basically in India, so the tax should be paid in India. The case moved to different courts, and finally in 2012, I think January, the Supreme Court ruled that this tax transaction is not taxable in India. So that is when the origin of this is the origin of the case. What happened then subsequently was, a couple of months later, as part of the budget, the then Finance Minister introduced an amendment to Section 9 of the Income Tax Act, which said that these transactions were always meant to be taxed in India. So he added a line that this is the clarification to this, basically clarified that provision, and also added a line that it was always meant to be taxed in India. What effectively it meant was all transactions dating back to 1961,
right?
Because that's when the Income Tax Act came into force, came under the tax net.
Which is why retrospective.
Which is why it is retrospective, right? So even transactions that happened prior to May 2012 came under the tax net, despite the fact that at that time, investors didn't really know that this transaction is taxable.
Right. So Ramya, as I said, this was largely seen as being regressive. It has got adverse reactions from courts, adverse verdicts from courts. Is that what led to this government? Because this government has also called it tax terror or something of that sort in the past.
This is when so what happened was, this happened in 2012. In 2014, the Modi government came to power. At that point of time, the government had been very clear that the Modi government very categorically said that they don't favor retrospective taxation. The then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley had in fact I think spoken in the floor of the House, where he said that this government will not bring in any amendments which are retrospective in nature. However, despite massive expectations, the government stopped short of scrapping this. So what they did was, there were a few committees that they set up, basically, internal income tax small groups which were set up to address this issue. There was this whole tax scheme, this Vivad se Vishwas scheme, which was floated for tax disputes. But despite all of these measures, this issue never resolved because the tax demands were too huge. All the companies felt really wrong. So it was not only big transactions that Kane or Vodafone, but they were around more than, I think, 15 cases besides these two, which got impacted because of these. If I'm not mistaken, there were companies like Macleod Russell. There were more such transactions that got impacted because of this retrospective amendment. And so companies felt that they were wrong and obviously went to the courts against the tax department.
Right. So now what is the immediate trigger? Because I'm not sure it was expected to happen so soon and so suddenly.
So I think the fact, even in fact, yes, there has to be an immediate trigger, right? Because what happened in November, in the third quarter of 2021, that's around October, December, the government lost in international arbitration against both Vodafone and Kane Energy in two separate arbitration courts. Still, one expected that yes, now that the government has lost its case, the government will take a high moral ground and say that okay, we will not proceed further. But even at that time, the Finance Minister was asked, and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman at that point talked about how these these arbitration decisions actually question the sovereign right of India to tax. So that is the reason why the government decided to appeal against both of these cases in the Court of Appeals. So as of December 2020, the government stand was that we will continue with this. There were many rounds of discussions that happened with Kane Energy. The Kane Energy representatives came to the finance ministry in January, Feb, March. During that period, there were several rounds of talks that happened. However, unfortunately, there was no forward movement. I think the trigger is the fact that Kane Energy has decided to aggressively go against
acquire
assets of So we heard on how we reported also. You can go back and look at our stories. How the first trigger was they filed a case in the US. One of the US courts basically said Air India is an alter ego of the Indian government. Let us confiscate its assets so that we can enforce our arbitration award. So in these two, there's a slight difference between Kane and Vodafone's case, because in Kane's case, Kane has won an arbitration award of nearly $1.7 billion. That is because the tax department had confiscated many of Kane Energy's shares in Kane India to make good of their tax demand. So because of which along with the tax demand and the interest that piled up, the total tax the claim that they won from an arbitration court was $1.7 billion. So for Kane Energy it was also a lot about recovering their dues. So that's how they went about it. So one was the Air India case, the Air India filing against Air India. Then again there was one recently wherein they went in and seized Indian government assets in Paris, and without the Indian government even realizing that this happened. So, and Kane has also filed cases in different other jurisdictions, including Canada and Singapore. So this was a company which was aggressively enforcing its claims against the Indian government. So it was becoming an embarrassment for the government also.
Right.
And end of the day, the kind of message that goes across every day, you have stories about how the Indian government continues to pursue such a retrospective and regressive tax, and it doesn't really send a good message to investors.
So is this now expected to significantly restore faith that foreign investors have perhaps lost in India?
Right. At least the government hopes so. So even if you would look at the bill and the statement, the statement that accompanies a bill explaining the rationale of why a government brings this particular amendments, it particularly talks about how this tax had become a sore point for investors. India is at a stage after the pandemic where it needs a lot of foreign investment to help with its quick recovery. And it specifically talks about how they expect that with this change, the whole confidence of foreign investors will be restored. One again needs to wait and watch, if foreign investors actually are convinced by this government's move, because I think it was also a lot about messaging and signaling, right? If this government had done it in the first 2 or 3 years when it was in power, it would have shown that it actually
the seriousness of with it.
Exactly, and the government, I think it would have reflected the government's intent to right this wrong, but unfortunately the government waited for 7 years, and eventually even now when they have moved on it, it looks as if there has been pressure, there has been
because
pressure
of the kind
from
of
different quarters. So that is another reason. Also the fact that Vodafone Idea, the entity now, is also struggling financially. So there are a lot of factors that have come in probably now to force the government's hand.
All right, okay, I've hogged enough of your time. There are many questions waiting. This is from Dev Verma, who's a new member of our YouTube community. Dev, thank you so much for joining the Print's YouTube community. Do you think this bill will be the end of arbitration cases with Vodafone, Kane and Vedanta for good and be successful in restoring investor trust over time, or more needs to change?
Right, specifically to these cases, it will all depend on how the companies react. Most likely, companies like Vodafone are likely to accept this because it's eventually an ending of a long-term dispute, and because Vodafone also has a presence in India. When it comes to Kane Energy, at least during their talks, when they had those talks with the government, I understand that at that point they were okay with the waiver of the fine. So the government this time, I haven't bought the context here. the government in the bill has said that they will refund any amount that they have collected as taxes, but they have said they will not make any interest payments. So that would effectively mean that Kane would get, whatever has been confiscated, that would be around $1.2 billion, but will have to forego around $500 million of interest.
So basically, now the fight could be about whether to get the interest.
Yeah, no. So the bill clearly says the government will not pay any interest. So now Kane has to take a call if they want to aggressively still enforce the award or take this matter forward because the government has filed an appeal against it, or is it okay with waiving off, letting go of that $500 million of interest. So in that case, yes, but effectively I think for most of these cases it should bring an end to most of these tax disputes, and it has been going on for nearly 9 years now because the act came in 2012. So many companies may want to just bury this and go ahead
and let it go. Right. All right. Avinash Raina, who's also a member of our YouTube community, is there a possibility that after some time a new government will come again and bring back this law? So I think, Ramya, there is larger consensus around how retrograde this is.
Right. So yeah, I don't think that is the possibility, because if you would look at it, this is something that has been criticized from across the political spectrum. Interestingly, you even had a Congress member, the Congress leader P. Chidambaram, who's also a former finance minister, talking about on how this is a good move and how this 8-year thing has been buried. So I don't think this kind of a law will come back again. But retrospectiveness, that is clearly a government prerogative. It's something that will depend on what the government of the day thinks and decides.
Right. Okay, so I'll club these two questions. One is from Vipin, who wants to know, is ease of doing business more important than quashing retrograde legislations from the point of view of foreign investors? So, or do they feed into each other? That's another question. And Tanveer Panjwani, apart from this, what are the other reasons which discourage foreign investment from coming to India?
Right, specifically on ease of doing business, for an investor, tax certainty, tax stability is a big thing, because eventually an investor who's putting in money needs to know at what point will they get returns. So for that, there needs to be a certainty on their business models. Business models to a large extent will depend on what kind of taxes are prevalent. So ideally, a stable tax regime is really important for an investor. Obviously, ease of doing business also includes other things in terms of easier registrations, easier permits, easier approvals. So all that I think comes together. It's not really an either or in this case.
Okay.
The second question was
the second question was, apart from this, that's from Tanveer Panjwani, what are the other reasons which discourage foreign investment from coming in India?
Eventually it's all about arbitrariness, right? If investors know that this is the kind of rules that they will face, they'll be fine with it. But unfortunately, even in investors also look at how states are functioning. So it's not only decisions that are taken by the central government, but even at states there have been many instances when there's a change in government. There's a change in policies, right? There's a change in the way land is allocated to businesses. So promised land allocations sometimes don't happen. The promised incentives that states make, in terms of say GST refunds or lower rates of electricity for a big manufacturing project, sometimes those promises are also rolled back. So there are concerns both at the central and state government level. It's eventually about keeping the promises that have been made, irrespective of whichever government is in power.
Right. This is another question from a YouTube member. Dave ABE90 is the handle. Even with this tax rollback, will Vodafone Idea survive, or are we looking at a two-player telecom market? So that's another hot button issue right now.
Right. Also, for Vodafone Idea, tax is basically an hit on the Vodafone, the parent arm or the UK arm of it. But for the Indian entity, we all know about the AGR dues that have piled up, the fact that there's going to be huge cash outgo among these two major telecom players, that will be Airtel and Vodafone Idea. So they are facing a cash crunch. Yes, there's a lot of talk on if the three major people in the telecom, if we'll see just a duopoly, but we don't really know how it will happen. Obviously, more competition is better for all of us, because that would mean lower, rates in terms of lower subscription rates.
Yeah. Right. Okay. PK, who's also a member of our YouTube community, will this retrospective tax rollback plus Amazon winning the case against Reliance help foreign investors and improve their confidence in Indian system? So that's another significant development.
Right. The Amazon win is more a win about the fact that the Indian judiciary is backing it basically the Indian judiciary upholding laws, existing laws. So it does reinforce the confidence of the investors in the Indian judicial system, but it's simply eventually about how much the government is able to convince investors that the promised good or a stable tax regime, a friendly regime would continue irrespective of if there's a change in
regime.
governments.
Right. Okay, David, Azra, how do these reforms contrast with the government bickering with other major companies like Twitter? So is there a bit of a contradiction in how this government approaches foreign entities?
Right. So it's not only Twitter, right, in terms of this whole privacy and these whole data regulations. Even if you would look at these recent draft consumer rules that had come in, that had caused a lot of heartburn among all of these foreign e-commerce companies, because the kind of rules and regulations that they propose to place on these companies will make it difficult for these companies to operate. So in terms of, there were regulations on flash sales, there were regulations on how these companies should advertise, there were regulations on how these companies need to, present products, whether in terms of how they classify products, and there was this, companies were asked to encourage Swadeshi products. So there are a lot of things that are there, many other rules, laws that are in place, which kind of, I agree with, the fact that there are concerns among some of these major investors. All of these e-commerce companies have brought in a lot of FDI into the country. So those concerns seem genuine at this point of time.
Right. So Ramya, before we close, if you were to look at, what next in terms of perhaps doing away with another roadblock, another stumbling block as far as foreign investment is concerned?
As I said, more better, transparent policies, transparent and stable policies, as well as this assurance that rules will not be changed depending on governments and depending on popular sentiment or opinion.
So stability is key.
Stability is the key for investors.
Right. All right. Okay, Ramya, thank you so much for helping us understand what impact the government's big move to scrap the retrospective tax will have. Thank you to our viewers for sending in their questions and for watching Government Matters. Keep subscribing to our YouTube channel. Become a member of our YouTube community. Have a good weekend.